responding to rejection. In the midst of all this suffering and rejection and some emerging very disturbing responses on Muhammad's part, he migrates, he flees from Mecca to Medina. And he finds in the Medinans a group of Arabs who are perhaps looking for something to help distinguish them, and they decide to bind themselves to Muhammad. They make a vow with Muhammad. They bound themselves to war against all and sundry for Allah and his apostle. So he finds a military backer, if you like, and becomes their leader, the leader of Medina. And Allah begins to reveal to Muhammad during that time that the earlier verses which said, forgive the unbelievers and overlook the things they say, which is really very practical when you're in a weak and vulnerable position, that they were abrogated, and now he was given permission to fight against unbelievers. So there was a threshold, a turning point, where he went from a more peaceful policy to a more militant one. And then it was revealed to him that persecution is worse than slaughter. Fight them until there's no more persecution. The word for persecution is an incredibly important concept in Islam, and it means it's fitna. It means harm or trial or anything that will unsettle Muslims in their faith is worse than killing. And at that point, Muhammad's testimony in the Quran begins to speak a lot about winners and losers. So when he goes to Medina, his rhetoric is about being superior, much more than it had been before. I'd like to speak with you, explain about fitna, this very important phrase, persecution is worse than killing, or fight them till there's no more persecution. This is the essence, this theological principle is the essence of Islam's response to things that oppose it or stand in its way. Fitna originally meant trial or temptation. It's a very similar concept to the Greek peresmos, do not lead us into temptation in the Lord's Prayer. Let us not be led into the time of trial. It's based originally on the idea of testing a metal by purifying it, putting it through heat. And so it meant originally actual testing, persecution. But later the concept gets extended in Islamic law to include anything which could undermine a Muslim or lead them away from their faith, or even prevent someone from entering Islam. So Ibn Kathir, in his commentary on one of these passages, says, Allah indicated that these non-Muslims are committing disbelief, so that's the crime of committing disbelief in Allah, associating with him, so having idols or so on, or son of God, being claimed to be God, things like that. And they're hindering people from entering Islam or from following Islam. This is much greater evil and more disastrous than killing. So disbelieving in Islam is much worse than killing. So killing them is not as bad as their disbelief. They are guilty of the crime, the capital offense of rejecting Islam, standing in the way of Islam. It's actually this worldview of the response to rejection, the response to persecution, to pressure, that is the heart of Islam's rejection of anything that impedes it or interferes with it. I'd like to give you some examples of recent statements by Muslim leaders that refer to this concept of fitna. The organization of the Islamic Conference, its Fiqh Academy, which is an international academy of jurisprudence, put out a fatwa on freedom of expression, and they recommended that there should be safeguards around the world to protect freedom of expression, regulated according to Sharia law, and taking into account the responsibility to legislate laws to protect Sharia and to have a just legal system, and to make use of available means to prevent the use of freedom of expression for insult to the firm sacred things and beliefs of Islam, or to sow fitna among Muslims. So you shouldn't use freedom of speech to cause Muslims to doubt Islam or be undermined. So sowing fitna, sowing persecution or temptation is saying or doing things that make Muslims doubt Islam. There should be laws to make that illegal, they're saying. They're trying to promote this agenda through the UN at the moment. Al Jazeera station was interviewing a Muslim Brotherhood cleric called Salim al-Awa, and he was criticizing a Coptic bishop who had said that Muslims were the guests in Egypt and Copts were the original Egyptians, and he was challenging some of the restrictions on the Copts that Islam had imposed. And the Muslims were very aggressive in criticizing him, and he said this bishop's statement is evidence for something deeply buried inside the church's people, wanting to cause fitna in this country. So he's accusing the Christian church of causing fitna, that is, causing Muslims to doubt Islam, causing instability in society that will cause people to walk away from Islam. And he said that they're aiming at a fitna, to burn the green with the dry. These church leaders are leading this fitna. This is what they do to cause fitna in the country. The fearful media are participating in it, causing the disaster, causing the war, which Bishop Bishoy is preparing for. So he's saying these Christians are causing fitna. And you have to read that in the light of the Quranic teaching, fitna is worse than slaughter. So he's actually giving a justification for attacking churches, attacking Christians. We should suppress them, because otherwise they will cause Muslims to lose confidence in Islam. They'll turn away, they'll undermine Islam. The OIC is running a campaign at the UN to influence the nations of the world, to override the traditional distinction between people and the ideas that they hold. And driven by the Islamic concept of fitna, they want to ban critical speech of Islam and encourage every country to prohibit it. Sayyid Qutb, who was a Muslim theorist for the Muslim Brotherhood, he said, this is my summary of what he said, it's only the freedom to choose Islam that mankind has any duty to promote, and non-Muslims will only enjoy this freedom when non-Muslim faith communities are completely subjugated under the dhimma. So if a non-Muslim status was superior or even equal to Muslims, this would be an obstacle to people entering Islam. That is, it would be fitna if non-Muslims are successful. So in Sayyid Qutb's view, any such power of non-Muslims must be smashed to remove all obstacles for entering Islam. So the reason why I went into those examples is I'm explaining how Muhammad's response to persecution, his idea that he came up with, that anything that undermines Muslims is worse than violence, actually becomes imprinted in the DNA of an Islamic worldview, and it's the way in which everything that challenges Islam is processed. And so when you're experiencing these sorts of very rejecting responses from the Islamic community to your message of the gospel, it's actually that personality of Muhammad, that his life experience that you're interacting with, that's rising up in a way in that situation. It's a spiritual engagement that you're having. So Muhammad had self-rejecting responses at first, like I should kill myself, I'm crazy, and then self-validating responses, I'm the best man that's ever lived. And finally, aggressive responses. I'll just destroy anyone who disagrees with me. At Badr here, they attacked a group of Meccans. It was a caravan, and the dead from Mecca were thrown into a pit. He mocked them. He went there in the middle of the night to talk to them. And someone said, "Why are you speaking to dead people?" He said, "Well, they can't answer back now." And he began to assassinate Jews in Medina. Beware, lest you suffer what's happened to the Quraysh who were killed at Badr. He said, you really know that I'm a prophet, it's just that you're lying and denying it. Accept Islam and you'll be safe. He called the Jews covenant breakers and losers, and there's a lot of information. I go into it more deeply in Liberty to the Captives, explaining the various charges he made against the Jews, and then he began a program of ethnic cleansing and genocide of Jews. And he said that he was distinctive amongst the prophets because he was victorious through terror. So Muhammad, the rejected son, if you like, the weakest and sort of meanest, in a way, lowest, of all his family, becomes the great rejecter of others. Muhammad the orphan becomes the orphan maker. This is the worst possible kind of response that a human being can have to rejection. It's actually to be owned by rejection and defined by it, to impose rejection on others and actually set up a spiritual system where, because Muhammad is the best example, his approach to rejection becomes the official doctrine of the faith, and then deeply imprints on the culture of the nations that accept his example as the best example. This has quite a lot of implications for dialogue and faith interactions. For example, direct criticism of Muhammad is usually a very bad idea when having dialogue with Muslims, because it's actually applying a rejection strategy. You know, Muhammad was rejected, and if you go in saying, "Oh, I'll reject Muhammad too," this will cause a reaction, an angry reaction. So it's actually responding to control with rejection. So you can't actually deal with rejection. So that's why apologetics against Islam is not going to be enough to challenge Islam. It's necessary to do it for lots of reasons, but it's not the solution to... If you have someone who suffers a great deal with rejection, giving them a really stern dressing down and a rebuke, why you're behaving this way, is very unlikely to do it for them. You have to actually go deeper and help to find healing for the wounds that they experience. You need a different strategy. So it's not that it's wrong to do the apologetic work. It's not that it's wrong to criticize Muhammad. It's necessary to do it. It's just that it will cause this reaction. And showing love is incredibly important to Muslims because you're really overcoming this rejection script. You're short-circuiting that rejection script. Another thing is if someone's responding with great control, responding with control back is not a good solution. So someone's trying to control you, you don't then respond. You shouldn't then respond with more counter-controlling measures. You know, I will out-control you, don't you worry. You know, that's actually not very good. You actually sometimes have to stand aside from control and let it rush on by and come in a different way. So these spiritual dynamics have a very significant impact upon how people relate to Muslims and relate to the Muslim community. One of the challenges, of course, is that you sort of surrender to it. You say, okay, I will submit to this worldview. I will be quiet. I will be intimidated. I agree to be controlled. I will accept your basis for being a free person. That's not healthy either. You need to be free in your own heart. And that's why I emphasize that people who are reaching out to Muslims should be people who are not suffering from major rejection issues and taking offense issues. You need to be relatively free in yourself, and you need to also be very determined, as it were, to follow Christ and to have his values so that you don't get caught up in the very thing that you're struggling against. That's the end of that section.